Hi all. So today we will talk about the introduction to the book that Willerslev wrote called Soul Hunters Hunting Animism and Personhood Among the Siberian Yukagirs. So this was published in 2007, and as he's kind of introducing an introduction, he's doing field work with Yukagirs, but not all of them. He's kind of describing how they're separated physically, and he was living for quite a while with Upper Kolima. That's the name of the region that the Yukagirs were living, that the Yukagirs that he lived with were living. And these people, he's giving a background into these people's lives. I think he's doing a very good job about that. He's kind of saying that he's giving us a historical background in saying like these people were under Soviet rule, and after that they transitioned to Russian state. But until 1960s, they were not very much integrated to the state economy, and after that they got integrated, and they kind of ceased their hunting practices, right? But in 1990s, with an economic crisis, women were able to find jobs, like work with wage salaries, but men couldn't. So they kind of went back to their hunting practices. And Willerslev was hunting with men. That's how he gathers his knowledge. And he is very upfront about the fact that his work does not represent the whole population of Yukagirs. Also, his work is not primarily representative of men. Sorry, it's not representative of women, but primarily representative of men, because he was doing the field work with men, not women. Also, this is like an example of how ethnographers' identity kind of shaping the ethnography. Yeah, so this would be a very different book if the ethnographer was a woman. So he's, as all of you in reflection papers, you were saying that he's kind of introducing this idea of mimesis, mimesis, and instead of animism. Yeah, these people's ways of seeing the world, it's very much reminiscent to animism, as Tyler talked about it or Durkheim talked about it, and he's saying actually these people, Tyler, Durkheim, previous anthropologist, they were seeing animism as an inability of so-called primitive people. Yeah, people were not able, according to Durkheim or Taylor, they weren't able to discern that human belonged to social reality and animals or non-animate things, they didn't have the soul. But Willerslev is saying they were wrong in thinking that, so they were imposing their own Western thinking, saying the Western thinking that thinks that people have souls and animals belong to another category or another domain of living, and they belong to another social reality. They were wrong in thinking this, but Willerslev also says that they were also wrong to think that animism amounted to a cosmology, to a set of beliefs that kind of defined people's every practices, everyday life, or all the things they do. I think he was very rightly saying that when you look at people's lives, you see that these people, at least Yukagirs, they do not think that non-animate things or animals have souls, or animals are people, or animals have language, all the time. This is not the case. He's saying that actually the way that Yukagirs think or interact with animals as persons is contextual, and it happens during hunting, not in other everyday practices. So Willerslev is emphasizing that, and then he's taking us to animism, to mimesis mimicry. And if we go to page 2, yeah, he's talking about, so in the very first paragraph, the second line, he says, "For us in the West, it is customary to assume that attributes of personhood, with all this entails in terms of language, intentionality, reasoning, and moral awareness, belong exclusively to human beings. Animals are understood to be wholly natural beings, and their behaviors is typically explained as atomic and instinctive. Among the Yukagirs, however, a different assumption prevails. In their world, persons can take a variety of forms, of which a human being is only one. They can also appear in the shape of rivers, trees, souls, and spirits, but above all, it is mammals that Yukagirs see as other than human persons." Yeah, so it's very, in this paragraph, what Willerslev is calling us to notice is very much similar to how Eduardo Kohn was kind of attracting our attention. Yeah, so he's kind of saying, like, in the Western world, language, intentions, reason, uh, these are all the things that make up a person, a human being, and this human being possess the culture, yeah, with tradition, with language, and animals belong to a different domain. They belong to the domain of nature. But here you see that animals, also what we attribute as nature, non-inanimate things like river, rocks, they kind of share the same social reality. So when we follow Yukagir's lead, we see that um, those oppositions, nature versus culture, or body versus mind, or soul versus mind, they do not hold true as in Western reasoning. And the project is what Willerslev is saying, what Willerslev is kind of defining his project is, he says, I don't want to romanticize and kind of accept Yukagir's point of view, because this is the way that the so-called primitive people who have beliefs or practices that are very unfamiliar to Western world were labeled, yeah? They were in anthropology either thought of as savage people who were like non-civilized, not yet civilized people, or kind of romanticized in terms of like, oh, they live very in tune with nature, we have so much to learn from them, they are very innocent. So both of them, you see, both the ways of thinking, they kind of strip away the agency from people who are not like Westerners. Yeah. So in the first one, in the savagery image, it is thought that people kind of lack civilization. Yeah, they are nature. They behave in according to their instinct. They're kind of very close to nature, but they haven't yet developed culture, and they're kind of dangerous. And in the other one, the innocent utopian image, they are kind of looked at as pure, innocent, and not yet contaminated by culture or civilization. But in neither of them, they are seen capable, or they are seen developed enough to represent themselves. Yeah, so Western man appears the person to represent, the person to talk about these savage or innocent people. And I think Ellison was kind of directing our attention to this, like, why have we, or why has the Western thought of itself as the uh, main model, to criticize or to judge other models? But Willerslev is saying, I don't want to kind of say that, oh, Western thought is wrong and Yuka Gears is right. But he is, I think, in a very fruitful way, putting the two, like the Western philosophy and Yuka Gears philosophy, in conversation and asking the question, what can this dialogue teach us? First, it can teach us, obviously, that the Western way is not the only way. Even if we have like born into it, and even if it is the way that we see the world, it is not the only way. So we can kind of broaden our horizon and perspective. Yeah, but it's also, so in page 2, I really like this. I know we have talked a lot about like how Tyler and other anthropologists depicted people with different beliefs, but if you go towards the middle of the second paragraph on page 2, Willerslev says, it's certainly true that anthropologists have tended to give little credence to accounts, such as that of old Britain, that differ radically from what we consider normal. In the early days of the discipline, Victorian scholars would say that if the old hunter were not actually lying, then he must be suffering from delusions of some sort and would be incapable of telling fact from fantasy or reality from dreams. Other, more recent anthropologists, by temperament and training, inclined to be rather more sympathetic to the indigenous viewpoint, would accept the hunter's story by adding an as if to his account. So instead of talking nonsense, the hunter is deemed to be speaking in metaphors, constructing figurative parallels between the two separate domains of nature and culture. So I think this summarizes very well the early anthropologists' view to animist practices. Um, and I want to go to the page 12 to talk a little bit about my misses. Yeah, so in bringing the my misses, Willerslev is saying that personhood is not pre-constructed, but is constructed in a relation. Yeah, in the relation when the hunter sees the prey. Yeah, and a little bit background about this scene. He details this in the rest of the book, but hunters believe that the spirit needs to give them permission to hunt, but also the animal's spirit, there's the big spirit and then the animal spirit, kind of they want to engage in a certain kind of love relationship between the hunter. Yeah, so the hunter in that moment of encounter, uh, by mm, imitating the prey, imitating the elk, yeah, thinks that he kind of deceives the elk in to think that the hunter wants to engage in a kind of relation, in a love relationship with the elk. Yeah, so in that moment, like as Willerslev describes in the introduction, in that moment the hunter is not an elk, because there is differences from an elk. He doesn't turn into an elk, and in he's neither not a human. Yeah, so it's he's in a very in a betwixt place, and he says this is very contrary to the way the Western thought has been conceptualizing the person. Yeah. So Descartes, he's saying he's focusing a lot on Descartes. Descartes, by saying that I think therefore I exist, he says this: there is the thought, the mind comes before engaging with the world. Yeah. So there is this dichotomy, there is this separation between the mind and the world outside, in accordance with Descartes' point of view. Yeah. uh, so the concepts that we learn about the world help us to engage with the world. Yeah. And he says this thought has been very dominant, and it is very present in Tyler's and Durkheim's way of thinking about anthropology and other people's beliefs, but it has kind of disputed, it has negated by Heidegger. Heidegger comes up with a different notion, which is being in the world. So Heidegger says we do not develop conceptions, abstract thought before we engage, but after we engage the world. Yeah? So the engagement, the experience comes first, and then the thought comes later. But Willerslev is kind of saying, when you look at Yukagir's practices of mimesis, you see that it involves both involvement with the world, like a practical engaging with the world, and a deep reflexivity. Because the hunter knows that if he totally becomes the elk will make him fall in love with itself, and then the hunter will lose its conception of human. The hunter will cease to be a human. Yeah, and Willerslev gives example of this in the rest of the book if you're curious about that. But here in page 12 it says, he says towards the middle of the first paragraph, in this sense we can talk about a kind of death reflexivity built into mimesis, a certain withholding or non-giving of the self. If in fact mimesis becomes totalizing and the imitator loses himself in what he imitates, we are no longer talking about mimesis but metamorphosis. Nothing is left to imitate when the difference between the copy and the original is totally gone. Yeah. So since there is not a total metamorphosis, there exists a kind of thinking or awareness of self, and also the engagement, also the act of imitating. And this quote was also given place in Ellison's reflection paper. It's very important, the second paragraph. The world of the Yukagirs is, as we shall see, just like this. People are here betwixt and between. Their souls are both substance and non-substance. They are both their bodies and their souls, their selves and reincarnated others. Hunters are both humans, and the animals they hunt both predators and prey, and so on. This condition of fundamental liminality or in-betweenness seems to have no ending. People must constantly steer a difficult course between analogy and identity, and tread a fine line between transcending difference and maintaining identity. They can and do transform themselves into various others, both human and non-human, but must avoid total participation and confusion. Um, oh, and I think another good point that Ellison kind of reveals in her reflection paper is that actually the way that Yukagiers treats personhood and identity is very much in line with when we think of gender and sexuality and how that is fluid instead of being fixed. Even if we tend to, even if Western ontology tends to see gender identity in a fixed position, or even sexuality, we see that in our lives, gender is much more about performativity, and it's also fluid. It's kind of, it changes as we do it, and we don't have to, or it's not even that we don't have to, but we make up our gender identity with our practices instead of our gender identity is predefined, yeah. And this is very much in line with what Judith Butler talks about gender and performativity. And I think, I'm not sure if Willerslev goes to there, especially because he's saying I'm not going to talk about gender that much. But I certainly think that what Willerslev sees in Yukagir's ways of seeing personhood can be discussed in how actually personhood in the West is not fixed or determinate as the Western ontology thinks of it to be. Yeah, so that was a great point. Um, so I think let's go to page 25. I think there was something. Yeah, this says the same thing on page 12 in a broader way, in a more detailed way. This is page 25, second paragraph. Towards the middle, it begins with thus. If you want to read, you can read. I'm not going to read because it basically summarizes what I just read. And I think another important point, as Rebecca was also saying in her reflection paper, animism is not a spiritual cosmology, but it's practice. So Willerslev is kind of inviting us to see how animism does not have to be amount to a different practice, to a different cosmology, to a different, totally separate ontology, but it's actually very contextual. It depends on experience, it depends on the practices, but not kind of a separate system of belief that these people see the world all the time. And this is important because in the authors that we've been discussing, for example, Nadasti or even Eduardo Kohn, they think of these different set of practices or beliefs in terms of cosmology, yeah, in terms of kind of system of belief in a way. And then they say, oh, this is very different than the Western cosmology. But I think even if Willerslev is kind of drawing, like in Nadasti's and Kohn's way of thinking, you say Western ontology and the Yukagir's ontology are two separate ontologies, and they cannot yet, therefore, they cannot put into conversation. Yeah, even if Willerslev is talking about ontologies in a way, he doesn't say that Western ontology and Yukagir's ontology, they are incompatible, they cannot be put into conversation because they're so separate. So he kind of moves away from thinking through Nadasti's or Khan's perspectives, but he has a different task in this book. He really wants to put Western way of thinking with Yuval's way of thinking, and he wants us to get a fruitful conversation out of that. Yeah. So I think we will for um, for Thursday we will read chapter 8, which talks about the formation of identity and the importance of language in this among Yuvagirs. I think it's a very interesting chapter. So, and it's nice to kind of elaborate on the same book. Yeah, I think this is all I have to say.